So I'll play the first segment here from Keitha.
So my name is Keitha Ogbogu, and I am the pastor at West Springs Church. We are a part of the Free Methodist Church in Canada, and I've been in Calgary for 2 years. I have 3 boys, one who is like 5 weeks old, and then a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old. And so we are just, I'm on maternity leave, so I've got all the time in the world to do these conversations, minus when I'm with kids. So maybe not all the time in the world, but enough time. I think that this move towards diversity and inclusion is actually part of the bigger story of the church's reemergence. Because the church for so long has been centered on how do we keep the core 50, 100, 700, whatever size your church, how do we keep those core people happy? Because we need them to keep giving and we need them to keep participating. How do we, so we don't want to rock them too much, and we need to make sure that this person gets their time on the stage, and all of these kinds of things that we kind of think through. And I think sometimes that it goes back to this idea of, I believe it's Nehemiah where it says, not in my strength or power, but by the Spirit. But it kind of goes back to this idea, and we all have the tendency to do it, is that we want to build something by our strength, and we want to build something by our power, and we want to build something by our strategies. But there is something powerful about leaning into the Spirit, because the Spirit moves in the way that the Spirit moves. And so the Spirit is never going to move the church away from inclusivity. The Spirit is never going to move the church away from diversity. The Spirit is never going to move us away from one another. And I think as we talk about this idea of diversity, so we have white churches and Black churches, we have, the Cambodian church and the Chinese church. But I think there is something powerful about churches that move from being Sunday-centric to neighborhood-focused. Because when you become a neighborhood-focused church, suddenly you are not just thinking about how Sunday morning enables you, but you are now thinking about how can we enable and enrich a community. And the community outside of the walls of the church are often far more diverse and far more inclusive even than what happens within the walls of a Sunday morning. And I think there's something really powerful about the Spirit moving churches as churches are trying to figure out, what do we do? How do we survive? How do we move forward? Moving people not only to be thinking about those who are within the church, who perhaps come from different backgrounds or ideas, but also to start thinking about, what is my call for this particular church in this particular neighborhood, in this particular space, for those who are just out walking on the sidewalks, who have businesses, who have families and schools. How does all of that come together to be not by my strength and not by my might, but by the Spirit, doing what the Spirit has always done? You were talking about Acts before we started recording. If we go back to Acts, what is one of the first things that happens is the fire, as the fire falls from heaven, is immediately the languages shift. And it is no longer one single language. Immediately, it is an invitation for everyone who is within hearing distance, immediately. And I think that that is a powerful picture of what is intended for our local churches as well.
So that's the first segment, and I think that's a really interesting place to begin in understanding how, in our struggle to find balance with a number of issues. So we're dealing with LGBTQ and affirming positions, we're dealing with Black Lives Matter, we're dealing with Black History Month, we're dealing with BIPOC issues of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and we're dealing with the Indigenous Church and the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the reconciliation work. And so all of these things tend to be sort of mounted upon one another, onto what the church is doing. And I think that there's a balance, is what she's saying, is that once we begin to work in this, and I go back to one of the early conferences that we held in 2018 on brave spaces. And one of the things that one of the presenters talked about was, when we do things like build a moment for working together, build an agreed upon view. So what he was talking about was the people with different physical capabilities being able to get into the church and being able to get into various centers and places. The way we address that opens up possibility for other ministries, other places. And so it brings us to a new realization about what is possible.
I like that. And everything that she said, especially when she started and said, the Spirit will never move away from anything that is trying to bring people together. And I know that people have said, oh, it's difficult work and it'll take long. And, we have to sort of give the Spirit the ability to lead, but we need to remind ourselves that the Spirit will never lead us into division or violence or harm. And so instead of pushing back at times when people or folks are saying, let's come together and do this for the community and as a community, we need to remember that, because it's being led by the Spirit. It's not just people saying, let's do this, especially when we're coming together as a community of faith. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was that environmental issues are also Black and Indigenous issues. And education issues are also Black and Indigenous issues, and that affects not just Black and Indigenous people, but BIPOC people as well. So when we're having these conversations, we're not saying to only talk about race or ethnicity or language or class or culture or gender, but we're saying to also see it from our perspective, through our lens, because we see things differently depending on where we are. So I think that was another good advice and good piece of wisdom to extract from that. And I know that the video was so much longer than what we shared, but I would like to encourage people to think about that. So when we're saying Black History Month, we're not saying forget everything else. We're saying, here's what we think about family. Here's what we think about community. Here's what we think about theology. Here's what we think about all of these things from the Black experience. And to encompass that to the wider conversation.
So I'm going to share the second video that we did, and then we'll have some time for discussion. And
I actually, it's kind of funny that we're talking about this. So this past year, I was asked to lead this task force that's to explore race within the Free Methodist Church in Canada. And I've had a few conversations, etc. What I find really interesting about the conversation around race and the church is how frequent the rhetoric is returned to myself or to other people of color that this is not actually a problem, that by talking about it, it's divisive, that you're just trying to have identity politics, that it doesn't matter, that you're just complaining.
Are you
And what
preaching?
people fail to recognize is that we are talking about human beings and that we're talking about lived experience. And so the moment that you stand and you tell someone that this is a waste of time, you essentially say your experience, you as a person, your history, your culture, your ways of seeing the world, all of it is a waste. And that you are gaslighting yourself, right? So that everything you've seen is a mirage. Everything's fine, but you are making this up. And it's such a dangerous rhetoric. And so as I'm doing this work with the denomination, I have a team that's mostly people of color from across Canada. And it's been really interesting to hear their stories, their perspectives, and how needed this was, not now in this heightened time of awareness, but how this was needed, generations ago.
Mhm.
So anti-racism work, every denomination needs to be in it, and too few are just starting.
Mhm. It's interesting with the United Church in 2018, they had a general council gathering, and at the end of that gathering, one of our Black clergy got up and spoke and talked about racism, and talked about racism in the church. And after that, there was around a 2-hour, more of a witness and testimonial of people coming up to the mic who wanted to talk about their experience of racism in the church, and this triggered a what we see today as the trying to deal with racism within the church, and the anti-racism declaration, which is it's a suggestion into how we step into that and how we work through that, because it's not something that we can sort of declare on paper. It has to be worked through and lived in.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting because it is very easy, right? So you have the two sides. You have the deniers, and then you have those who really want to be supportive. And it's very easy to use our mouths and our fingers to support anti-racist rhetoric. But it is much more difficult to live it out. It is much more difficult to invite the person who is perhaps has an accent and is from a different country and looks different to participate in the service. This is challenging, even for me, just with my Canadian bias to do sometimes. It is very difficult to spend as much time as, in my experience as the pastor. I was in Saskatchewan before I was here, and the church that I was at, the number of people of color, it grew immensely with my presence, not immediately, but over time. And part of it, I think, has to do with this idea of representation, that so often we do not see people of color standing at the front of churches. And so people who are present often don't feel either welcome, or they feel like they're present, but they're not to participate. They're to participate in the background. You see the same thing. I mean, I did a whole talk once on this same idea with women, that women were in the basement growing up and men were upstairs in church. So women were like cooking and cleaning and watching kids, and men were speaking and in meetings and all of those things. But it can be similarly seen with the idea of diversity. So you can have a lot of white presence in terms of leadership, and it takes a lot of work to move into accepting or seeing or inviting individuals who come from different backgrounds, from different cultures, with different races, to participate in the actual formation of what it looks like to be the church. And so we often think about, we want you to come, but we don't necessarily want you to participate. We want you to sit at the table. So I talk about being invited, but not welcomed. So we want people to come, but we don't necessarily do the work of welcoming. And it's a challenge because you have language and you have culture, and you have, we were just chatting before about how, my bend to worship is loud and fun and clapping and dancing. And sometimes when you come into other settings, people feel like that is so foreign and strange. We don't even want to try those kinds of things because it feels so different. And sometimes we just have to push through that difference to help people move from those words of, we want to be a multicultural church, we want to be an intercultural, we want, into a church that's actually living those things out.
I think that's a really good place to stop and think and maybe ask the question. Dieulita, maybe you want to start with your response?
Everything she said, I think I co-sign everything she said, and it's almost an affirmation of what I've been thinking without the words to say it. Yeah, everything Keitha said.
You're also doing the lay leadership or the programming part. Are
I
you
am,
training? Yeah. I think
which
that's
is
encouraging. Yeah.
interesting because I don't think that people understand, and this is going to go just a tad bit deep. So when we're saying decolonized approach or decolonized lens, they don't understand that to become a minister, you are taught in the European way. You're introduced to ministry through the European way of worshiping, of preaching, of dissecting the Bible, of leading. It's not done in an African way. It's not done, I think as an Indigenous minister, you have a different approach. But for the most part, the church does not have a comprehensive way of teaching the gospel. It's still very much the same thing that was used from the 1700s to the 1800s. So it hasn't evolved. And so I find it challenging in learning to become a lay minister to reconcile that, because there are so many things where I have to say, okay, we need to look at it from this point of view. The hymns are still very much the same. The hymns have not changed. There's a few added hymns, but they're not readily available. The way you're thinking about Paul and his approach to slavery or women, now we sort of dismiss it and say, well, that's not what it meant. But that particular passage and Paul was used to continue to enslave people. Like it was literally said, Paul said, go back to your masters. So people who would run away, as Christians and people who had believed and who were baptized into the church, they had to reconcile with that, because that's what was used to them, that they should obey their earthly masters and things like that. And so I when we're saying that we want to be an anti-racist church, I wish that we understood the deeper impact of what that means. Because to be an anti-racist church, we would have to destructure, in order to do it correctly, we would almost have to destructure the church as it is now and build it back up again together. Because to do it in any other way would almost defeat the purpose. Mm-hmm. It would also mean giving up the seat of the privilege, like I like to call it, because you can't have the same people in leadership roles and suggesting that we're going to be anti-racist, or to have one Black person. Because I know that's the other thing too, right? You have one Black person who becomes president or prime minister or minister, and then suddenly all of the problems disappear, and that's not the way it's done. And so I would like to see more intention behind becoming an anti-racist church, like active work, and not just we're an anti-racist church.
I think one of the things that we so often neglect when it comes to engaging people of color is that we forget that it has to be intentional. So we think that we often feel like, well, you come, so you must be satisfied. And we're not really doing a great job. And I'm not sure I even do a really great job, but of sitting down and being intentional about inviting and that kind of welcoming space to help move people intentionally towards leadership, to help move people intentionally towards not just leadership within the local church, but also within the denomination. And I know I have heard it said, well, but they just don't like exist. Like we don't have qualified people of color to sit in these positions. But when you sit down and kind of dig deep, you realize that they're there, but they just didn't realize that they too were part enough to participate at that level, make decisions, to help shape and form things. And I think until we get comfortable, even just allowing people to change the service, right? Because that's like one service, like it actually doesn't make a big deal, but it feels in the moment like it makes a big deal, like it's a huge deal. But if we can change the service 1 or 2 times a year, like that's like one tiny step. But when the burden is on the person of color, so such as myself, to do that pushing, then it feels to some, well, you're pushing it for your own agenda. So I would love to have white people surrender. I always talk about moving people from the margins to the center. And I would love for those who are in the center to make space for those on the margins, and for them to take some of the initiative, and them to take some of the, to shoulder some of that work of moving people into the center. And it doesn't mean that you displace others permanently or constantly, but to give opportunity for people to see this space does not just belong to those who are the powerful, but this space also belongs to those who perhaps have always just sat on the fringe. This space is for all of us. And to do that takes intentionality, and it takes intentionality every single week. It takes intentionality in who you're going to call, who you're going to visit with after the service, all of those things. People want people from different ethnic groups to participate and to be present, but you have to do the work. So.
Yeah, I think that's important with the participation, as Keith is saying, is that we cannot do this in silos. We have to bridge these various parts of the church.
Yeah.
Make them sing, in a holistic way. So does anybody have any comments or thoughts?
My name is Toby.
Hello.
Hi, Toby.
I guess.
Oh, hello.
I guess I'm known to a lot of people in the church, and I think that the church really needs to change their approach. We need to start seeing things differently, which regards to our difference or our differences in terms of people. I see that God in his infinite wisdom make all things in different shape, in different form, for just one reason: to complement each other. As much as the bird can survive on their own, they need a tree, they need insects, they need the fishes. So also we human beings. We have to celebrate our differences. We have to acknowledge that we're different from each other. We do not have to shy away from it. And by so doing, we will be able to have, be able to celebrate each other, and then be able to, put up a common front. But as long as we want to have these Eurocentric kind of mentality and Africans mentality, there's always going to be conflicts. There will always be one person that want to say, no, I want to be heard. Everybody's lives matter. That is what I preach. And that's my approach of life. Everybody's lives matter. Be it black, be it white. Until we get it right, we will always struggle as a church. Now we're talking about the spirit. The good thing about the Spirit of God is that He is so dynamic in His doings. He has a way of form, and He's never going to walk in a church or in an organization or in a midst of people that are divided. The Spirit of God, we always work where there is love, where there is understanding, and that is how God wants us to see ourselves and work with each other.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's Toby. He's with the LGBTQ settlement practitioner with the Center for Newcomers, and so he'll be our guest as well next week as we continue the final episode of this series next week. So I just want to play the final video that we have from Keitha.
So there's this trope of, even when it comes to worship, that they want you to be the Black preacher or the Black speaker. Like you have to be the loud, the clapping, the hallelujah shouting.
Yeah.
And if you're not that, then it's almost like, okay, well, are you really a Black preacher? And then there are those people who really cannot stand to sit in the pew and watch a Black preacher. Like it's so foreign to them that it's so uncomfortable. It creates so much discomfort for them that they cannot sit for an hour and a half. And I have been to churches where if people know that there's going to be a Black preacher or speaker or an Indigenous preacher or speaker, they don't show up. Like people just don't show up. The numbers fall because they're so uncomfortable and it's so strange. And I said, the only way we're going to get over that is to create more of that discomfort so that we can have the growing pains and grow into that to where it's comfortable for people now. So I just wanted to add that little bit.
I love that idea, and it's challenging. So I lead in a white denomination with a mostly white congregation, and it is challenging because so I've always had people who kind of I grew up in Northern Ontario, so we were like highly a minority. Like I remember when my mom met the Black lady around the corner, and like they were like, we are now best friends, okay, because we're in solidarity. You live like less than a kilometer away from me, and like it was like hone in on this person that's the same. And so we were very much a minority. But I remember my sister said once to me, she said, do you realize like people see us as exotic, like exciting, right? They're like, wow. And I kind of feel that way too. Like I have not had people walk out because I'm Black. It's to my knowledge, but I have had people leave because I'm a woman. So I haven't had that so much the experience that I have people more that they're excited to have me there. They're enthusiastic, and then I will have the comment, oh, but you don't sing, right? Like
I spoke last year at an event, and I would tell them all the time, because I was wearing a mic, and I said, okay, when it's time for us to sing, you have to mute the mic. And they didn't get that. I was like, no, you're muting the mic. You have to mute the mic.
Nobody wants to hear me sing. That's not my gift. That is not my talent. God has called me to preach, to speak, but he has not called me to sing. And he ensures that I stay quiet. But like that's one of the stereotypes, is that of course she's this big Black woman. She has this deep, deep voice. She's gonna belt it out. Sorry, I'm not a gospel singer. But yeah, so we have some of these ideas about what it's going to be like. But I've mostly had people excited to have me around, like it's different, it's new, and then maybe I disappoint them a little because I'm going to approach my pastoral work in terms of leadership and in terms of following the Spirit. I'm not going to approach it in terms of trying to live up to an expectation that comes from anywhere other than what is God speaking, where is God leading. And we know what happens when we try to live up to the expectations of those around us. So often we fall and we fail. But I am excited when churches, that the church in general seems to be moving towards having these conversations. They're long overdue. They're long overdue. But I know as I have these conversations within my own circle, whether it's at the local church level, but mostly within the broader, bigger church, within our denomination, is I have those conversations with people. I just see this kind of light opening up within these people of color as they are saying, finally, our voices have an opportunity to be heard. I remember speaking at something, and afterwards I had these Black women come to me and say, we didn't know that there were Black women preachers within our denomination. We didn't know, and I am the only one, so that's why they didn't know. But now there are more. And I just love that idea that this idea of presence and representation can create ripples of change and help people to see this is not so unusual. This is not so scary. This is not so strange. And I'm really excited to see what happens 10 or 15 years from now when those who are in high school become those who are or more in the leadership roles, because I think they're going to have a completely different bend towards embracing things that are perhaps slightly different.
I think it's interesting. So that's the the segments that we have from her, and I think that was to me it's really enlightening, because the same thing is going on with the Indigenous Church. The people that we have, I think we just graduated 8 ministers this last round, and so there's a continual stream of people coming out of the San DeSoto program. I think we have about 85 ministers at this point, and from other programming, and the work together, it makes that advocacy, I think, something that we can hold together and something that we work through, rather than one telling the other. And so I think that's a very hopeful sign to me. Dieulita, do you have anything to add before we end? I think we're trying to end by 11:30.
Yeah, just 2 things. One, I was as Keitha was talking about that, because I struggle with that as a speaker. Like, people expect me to be the Black speaker, right? Like to bring it all in. And I don't sing, like I was saying in the clip, I don't sing at all. And so when I'm speaking, people almost like expect me to bring out that good gospel song. And I'm like, no, you have to mute the mic. I cannot sing. But that's because we're often associated with being good spiritual singers, which is an amazing thing. Like, I wish I had that gift, but I do not. But I think it's interesting that sometimes people like, are you sure? Because you're Black and all Black people can sing, right? And I know that's something that Indigenous people are often seen as being like the wise people, right? Like always providing that sort of wisdom. So Juni, how do you reconcile the two? Like, how do you reconcile that as a minister, or are you always an Indigenous minister?
I can almost sing. I think for me it is because it's sort of a legacy thing, and from the perspective of while going through San DeSoto, there's a lot of people who go through that program who come from families of ministers, and that seems to be, it's almost like a priestly class. I don't want to say a priestly class, but it is something that we see as an option to what we do, in the way that we were raised, and the way that we believe. And so I think that as long as those 3 things sort of connect, then there's a potential for doing good works in this area. And so we may not do it well all the time, and we may not live up to that, but we can still try. And for the time that we have, it feels good to be able to fulfill that role in a way that challenges the expectation, and the way that challenges the way that we are seen and the work that we do. So for me, this embrace of a lot of the affirming side, a lot of the BIPOC side, and especially around this idea of working together and working in harmony to demonstrate how we can kind of pull down some of those barriers. So I think we need to turn around to some of the people in the audience. Yes. And if not, I'm going to start pulling on people who have mentioned in the chat, because John's there. So who wants to start?
John Griffith always has like amazing things to say. I always look forward to John.
That's your cue, John.
Well, what I'll say is that I really enjoy hearing the perspective, Black perspective, and understanding more. But when I come back to Hillhurst, I still cannot envision what it means to be anti-racist. Like, what would that mean? Do we import Black people or Indigenous people? Do we partner with a Black church or an Indigenous church? Like, I don't know what that means.
That's a good question. And I think as a church, that's where the church part comes in, where you sit together and say, okay, what would it mean for us to actually be an anti-racist church? Mm-hmm. And it will be to bring up those questions. And it may mean to partner with a predominantly Black church, it may mean listening for a month to people just coming in and saying, these are our stories, and not so much to tell us what to do, as opposed to how can we worship together, not just once a month, once a year, or but how can we actually create that? And I think when you start asking those questions is when people will see that you actually mean what you're saying. Because it's very easy to say we're anti-racist. It's very easy to say we're diverse. It's very easy to say we're multicultural, but to live it out is the hard part. And asking is the hard part, and following up is the hard part. So I think your question can actually go to the wider Hillhurst church community, where you have conversations and say, what would that mean for us to be an anti-racist church? Because that's a pretty big, I don't want to say burden to carry, but that's a big challenge.
Yes, Suzanne.
I think it's really important for all of us to remember there's no magic recipe here. And it's definitely not for Tony or Dieulita to help us solve our anti-racist issues. They are white issues. They're issues of white privilege, and we need to own them, and we need to try and do what we can. And if we do it wrong, tell us we do it wrong, because we need to know. And it just makes me so frustrated when it comes to tokenism, and when there's pieces of expectation that it's an expectation that you're going to help me solve the problem. It's a problem of me and my ancestors. We need to solve this.
Thank you for that. And that's a conversation that Tony and I have had, as well as other friends and colleagues, because and I had shared last week, I think, no, last week with Tony, that this month has been the most difficult for me in attempting to celebrate Black History Month, but as well as the pushback that we've gotten, and just people not understanding what it is. And I try to remind people that Black History Month wasn't created for other people. It was created for us to remember that we're humans, because we were not seen as being human beings, full human beings. When I often hear the phrase, people would say, I'm here to learn, educate me. And I'm like, I can't, because it's not an educational course. It's not a spiritual course. It's everyday living. And it's recognizing, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing right? How I can reach out, as opposed to just me creating a list and saying, okay, if you do all of these things, then you're an anti-racist church. That's not how it works. It means us living and thriving together, but sharing space and giving grace and sharing love, and making it the norm. And sometimes it means, again, getting out of our comfort zones and maybe worshiping at a Black church for a month or 2 or 3 or a year, because then it changes your focus of where you are. It makes you listen. It allows you to be a part of, and not just that piece, as well as the Indigenous factor is always there, to remember how Black people came to this land, and how and why, right? And talk about the land, and talk about where we are, and talk about how we got here. But for so long, we haven't talked about all of those things. We've talked about bits and pieces, but we haven't put it all together to give us that big picture. So it's like talking about Easter, Christ's resurrection, without talking about the crucifixion. Easter doesn't make sense if you don't talk about crucifixion. And you can't talk about the crucifixion without also talking about his birth. And you can't talk about his birth without talking about his mom and his dad and how that came. So we have to get the entire picture and put it all together. And then we wouldn't say we're an anti-racist church. People will tell us we're an anti-racist church. We will become known as the anti-racist church and anti-racist people. It's just like, you know, if you're a Flames fan, you don't have to tell people. They will see it, right? Because you're going to be shouting, "Go Flames, go." You'll wear your jersey. You will just walk around with pride. And you will know that, and you will see other people and you will recognize that, because they too will be wearing their jerseys and, you know, or the hat at a grocery store, any of that. Like, people don't have to walk up to you and say, "I'm a Flames fan," for you to recognize that. And so I think it's accepting it for what it is. Firstly saying, okay, we have a problem, because in order for us to be anti-racist, that meant that we were racist. And for a lot of people, that's the hard part. So I know that sounds like I'm preaching. I'm really not.
You're natural.
Yeah, Tony.
So I'll kind of end with this as we're following up on this. So one of my good friends and colleagues once did a teaching where he showed like a ruler that had the negative and positive numbers. And he said, so often when we're talking to people about things that have to do with faith and Jesus and all of that, he said, we think everybody's starting at the same spot. And he said, so we think everyone's starting at -1. And so they just need to get to +1 and then move forward. But he said, we forget some people are starting at like -50. And it takes the conversation at the -50 is very different than the conversation at the -1. So the experiences that person has had, the people they've gotten to know, all of that is very different than the person who's already kind of walked through those steps. And so that's why I think just laying down this idea of church must be so focused on this Sunday morning growth, rather than thinking about how can we reach out beyond. I always say, you know, it's one thing to have growth on Sunday, and it's another thing to extend your reach. And I said, when you extend your reach, there is something powerful that happens, because suddenly your church does grow, but it grows not simply because you had better music or not, but it grows because you matter to the people around you as a community. This institution has now become human beings. This institution has now become a place where people feel welcome. This institution has now become a place that is warm and engaging and accepting. And it changes how people view what is just a building that they often don't see, an invisible building that they drive by, an invisible building that they wonder what happens inside, an invisible building that they might Google just to make sure you're not a cult. But suddenly and Jesus does this beautifully throughout the Gospels, when he comes away from simply just that, you know, preaching and kind of standing on the mountain, and we see him then talking to the guy who's up in the tree, right? And that's the difference when we see him encountering the tax collector, when we see him being face to face with the woman who was caught in adultery. Suddenly, these conversations change, and it is no longer just Judaism versus whatever. Suddenly, we're talking about actual people and human beings. And it moves away from this institution, and it moves away from this defense of we are the rightful owners of this land, and we are being taken advantage of too. We have this story together. And when you think back to that Jewish time, right? So they're occupied. I mean, the conversation that Jesus comes up with is less about politics and far more about how do we see the world differently. And because we see the world differently, we operate differently. And when we operate differently, suddenly the power structure that allows Rome to overtake to overtake us has to be destroyed. The power structure that allows this woman to be cast out into the street has to be destroyed. The power structure that gives you the authority to steal as a tax collector, suddenly that, right? Like, and you see these things begin to fall apart. But it starts with things moving from these metrics and measures that seem to be, once again, in my own strength and my own might, into something that is far more spirit-filled, something that's about the kingdom of God coming to life and light. So I could talk about this for hours, but I will not.
Thank you for taking the time to join us. So we've been speaking with Reverend Keitha Ogbogu from the West Spring Church, the pastor of West Springs. Okay, maybe one last question and we'll end off here. Anyone with any final thought? Toby.
So yeah, I've been in Hillhurst for close to 3 years now, and I was very active for 2 years, and then school happened, job happened, and I kind of, fell between the cracks. But the truth be told, I think we are an anti-racist church, because while I was there, I was fully accepted. To be honest, I'm not trying to make anybody feel good about themselves, but I'm just saying the way it is. I've seen a lot of Black people come around as against what I was used to while I was in the States. Going to white church in the States is a privilege, because you're not gonna feel accepted, not in any way. But when I came to Hillhurst, I was fully accepted, and I was involved in everything and everything. So, but having said that, I think we need to go further and, kind of like reach out. In terms of reaching out to the Black community, we not doing a lot in that section. We need to reach out, try to find out what's going on. Some of our members, they're not showing up anymore. And I know a lot of them have families, they have issues, they have things they're dealing with and stuff like that. They feel a little bit, not so free with, basically, I think we need also to change the mode of worship a little bit to, kind of like bring in some little of African culture and stuff into it. It is too westernized for me as a person, because I'm used to dancing, I'm used to loud music, I'm used to stuff like that, and then having to come to Hillhurst and I just sit down, just say the hymns and do all that. Typically, to me, it looks like an old school kind of a thing. And that's why we're not getting a lot of Black people coming in, because they used to loud music. They used to dancing, not, once that vibes is introduced, we're gonna see changes. We're gonna see a lot of Black people coming to Hillhurst.
That's awesome. Thank you, Toby. And we wouldn't be having this conversation if Hillhurst was not taking a step, if Hillhurst was not doing the work, if Hillhurst wasn't prepared to continue to do to take on that big challenge, because it always starts with conversation, right? And it starts with hearing people's stories and questions and just being part. I feel like I'm more a member of Hillhurst than I am of my own church. I did not attend the event last night, so I hope that I can still be a member somehow. But it's like Toby said, it's being here. We are here and we're having that conversation, which is amazing. And I shouldn't say but our church, Hillhurst, has been vocal about things and has been present. And it's taking it to the other step. It's continuing. It's being the 7 day a week church on issues like this, right? And I'm excited and I'm proud and I'm optimistic to be here. Thankful as well, because for a Black Haitian woman to be speaking at Hillhurst, like, to me, I'll always be grateful for that. The same way I'm always so grateful when Tony calls me and say, let's have this conversation. Let's talk about this.
So we will continue our conversation next week with our final segment of the Black History Month. Invited everyone to the Pink Shirt Day event that we're hosting at 7:30 p.m. on Wednesday, and that's part of the Lenten series that we're doing on the 7 Sacred Teachings. So join us if you can, and I think that's all that we have for today.